The wind howled across the high desert plateau, a relentless chorus that swept through the canyon like a restless spirit. Inside a modest cabin, Marshal Elias Crow sat alone, the embers of his fire casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He had long since given up on sleep, finding more comfort in the silence of the late hours than in the restless dreams that plagued him. The weight of 30 years as a lawman was etched into the deep lines of his face, a map of battles won and innocent lives he couldn't save. He poured himself a cup of cold coffee, the bitter taste grounding him in the present, when a sound cut through the moaning wind of fate, scratching at the glass of his window. His hand instinctively moved to the worn leather of his holster, a reflex that had kept him alive for decades. But as he rose from his chair, he noticed the scratching was too weak, too desperate to be a threat. He approached the window slowly, his boots silent on the wooden floorboards, and pulled back the heavy curtain. A girl, no more than 16, stood pressed against the outside wall, her face illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds. Her dress was torn, her hair a tangled mess, and a dark bruise spread across her cheekbone like a storm cloud. Her eyes, wide with a terror that went deeper than simple fear, met his, and she didn't run. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He didn't demand her name or shout questions into the night. He simply turned from the window, walked to the heavy oak door, and unlatched the iron bolt. The door swung open with a groan, letting in a gust of cold air that bit at his skin. The girl flinched as if expecting a blow, her shoulders hunching inward to protect herself. Elias stood in the doorway, a large silhouette against the warm glow of the fire behind him. He looked at her, not with suspicion, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had seen too much suffering to ignore it. In a low, steady voice, he said the only words that mattered: "You're safe." The tension in her small frame seemed to crack, but she did not weep. Instead, she took a hesitant step forward, her bare feet raw and bleeding on the cold, hard ground. Elias stepped aside, leaving the door open wide, an invitation that required no further words. She crossed the threshold into the cabin, and the warmth of the dying fire seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. She stood in the center of the room, shivering violently, her eyes darting to the corners as if expecting shadows to reach for her. Elias closed the door, shutting out the wind and the darkness, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken stories. He moved to the hearth, adding 2 logs to the embers and coaxing the flames back to life with a gentle breath. The fire crackled and grew, casting a steady, comforting light across the room. He fetched a thick wool blanket from a chest by his bed and, approaching her slowly, draped it over her shoulders. She flinched again at his proximity, but the warmth of the blanket seemed to anchor her. He gestured to a wooden chair near the fire. "Sit," he said, not a command but a simple offering of rest. Her legs gave out, and she sank into the chair, pulling the blanket tight around her. Elias busied himself with practical things, the kind of tasks that gave a frightened soul time to breathe. He put a kettle on the iron stove, the familiar clink of metal a soothing rhythm in the quiet cabin. He retrieved a basin of water and a clean cloth, setting them on the small table beside her. Without a word, he knelt down and began to examine her feet, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the dirt and grit from the deep cuts. She watched him, her eyes still wide, but the wild, animalistic fear was slowly being replaced by a fragile, bewildered curiosity. She had not expected kindness. He wrapped her feet in clean strips of linen, his movements efficient and practiced. Only when he was finished did he look up at her, his gaze calm and unwavering. "My name is Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. He didn't ask for her name in return, understanding that such things could wait. He poured her a cup of tea, sweetened with honey, and pressed it into her trembling hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, and she brought the cup to her lips, the simple act of drinking a profound victory over the shock that held her captive. The first sound she made was a small, involuntary sigh as the tea warmed her from the inside. Elias sat across from her in his own worn leather chair, giving her the space she needed. The fire popped and hissed, the only conversation between them for a long while. He watched the girl's face, seeing beyond the bruises and the dirt. He saw the strength in her jaw, the way she held herself even in exhaustion. He recognized the look of someone who had run a very long way and was only now allowing herself to believe she could stop. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily into the early morning hours. When the cup was empty, she finally spoke, her voice a dry, broken whisper. "They'll come looking." It was not a question, but a statement of a terrible fact she carried with her. Elias didn't pretend to misunderstand. He knew what kind of men left such marks on a child. How many? He asked, his tone even, betraying none of the cold anger that settled in his chest. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the empty cup. 3, maybe 4. They have horses. They were. Her voice faltered, and she looked away, unable to finish the sentence. Elias simply nodded, processing the information. "They won't find you here," he said, the words a solid promise. He stood up and walked to a cabinet, retrieving a worn-out shirt and a pair of trousers he'd kept from his younger days. "You can change into these. There's a cot in the back room. No one will get past me." He handed her the clothes, his gaze never lingering where it shouldn't. She took them, her hands still shaking, and for the first time, a single tear traced a path through the dirt on her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, as if ashamed of the weakness, but Elias pretended not to see. She disappeared into the small back room, and Elias heard the soft click of the latch. He didn't move from his spot by the fire. Instead, he began to methodically prepare. He checked the cylinder of his Colt revolver, spinning it to ensure it was loaded. He pulled his Winchester rifle from its rack by the door, running a hand along the polished stock. He moved with the calm, deliberate precision of a man who had faced death many times and had no intention of meeting it tonight. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if the darkness came to his door, he would be ready to meet it with fire and lead. When she emerged a few minutes later, she was swimming in the old clothes, the sleeves rolled up several times and the trousers tied with a piece of rope. She looked smaller than before, stripped of the tattered dress that had been her armor. She paused in the doorway, looking at the rifle in his hands, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "It's for them, not for you," Elias said, his voice softening. He set the rifle aside and pointed to a cot he'd set up in the corner of the main room, within sight of the door and the fire. "Sleep. I'll be right here." She hesitated, her gaze lingering on the door as if expecting it to splinter inward at any moment. Slowly, she walked to the cot and lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She curled into a tight ball, a posture of self-preservation that spoke of long nights spent hiding. Elias returned to his chair by the fire, positioning it so his back was to the flames and his eyes faced the door. He laid the rifle across his lap and settled in for a long night's watch. He didn't close his eyes, his senses attuned to every sound outside the cabin walls. For 2 hours, there was nothing but the wind and the occasional snap of the fire. Elias remained motionless, a statue of vigilance. Just before dawn, when the sky was a deep, bruised purple, he heard it. The distant, rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed earth. More than one horse. He rose from his chair, his joints protesting after hours of stillness, and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtain. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their forms dark shapes against the paling sky. They moved with purpose, scanning the ground, following a trail that led directly toward the cabin. A small sound came from the cot, and Elias turned to see the girl sitting upright, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She had heard them too. "It's them," she whispered, her voice laced with a terror that made her whole body tremble. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside the cot, his face level with hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low, commanding whisper that cut through her panic. "You stay here. You do not move. You do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, you do not come out. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes locked on his, finding a strange, desperate comfort in the unwavering calm of his gaze. Elias grabbed his coat and his hat, then stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. The morning air was cold and sharp. He stood in the center of the porch, his rifle held loosely but visibly in his hands, his posture one of quiet authority. The three riders saw him as they crested the final rise, and they slowed their horses, their approach turning from a confident pursuit to a cautious advance. The largest of them, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, spurred his horse forward. "Morning, Marshal," the scarred man said, his voice dripping with false cordiality as he reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. Elias didn't return the greeting. He just stared, his face an unreadable mask. "We're looking for a girl," the man continued, dismounting. "A runaway. Belongs to us. We saw tracks leading this way. You see anything?" He took a step toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the windows. Elias shifted his weight, the barrel of the rifle rising just an inch, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. "You've made a wrong turn," Elias said, his voice like grinding stone. The scarred man's hand drifted to the pistol at his hip. "Now, Marshal, there's no need for trouble. We're just honest men looking to retrieve our property." Elias's eyes narrowed, a flash of the old, relentless lawman surfacing. "I see no property. I see men trespassing on my land. And I see a girl's face marked by a coward's fist." He stepped off the porch, his boots landing solidly on the dirt, closing the distance between them. "You have 10 seconds to get on your horse and ride out. If you cross my threshold, you won't walk back out." The threat was not in his words, but in the absolute certainty with which they were spoken. The three outlaws exchanged glances, weighing their numbers against the reputation of the man standing before them. The scarred man's face twisted with rage, his pride warring with his survival instinct. For a tense, eternal moment, his fingers twitched over his gun. Elias didn't blink, his finger resting on the trigger guard of his rifle, a hair's breadth from death. Finally, the scarred man spat on the ground and took a step back. "This ain't over, Crow," he snarled, mounting his horse. Elias watched in silence as they wheeled their horses around and rode back the way they came, their figures shrinking until they were swallowed by the dawn. Elias waited until the last echo of the hooves faded into the vast silence of the desert before he allowed his shoulders to relax. He turned and walked back to the cabin, the morning sun now cresting the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He opened the door to find the girl standing just inside, her hands pressed against the wall as if she had been leaning against it, listening. She looked at him, and for the first time, there were no tears of fear in her eyes. "They're gone," Elias said, taking off his hat. She nodded slowly, her gaze holding his. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Elias hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Yes," he said, looking at the new day dawning. "I did."